I am, relatively speaking, a newcomer to the nuclear field. I joined this industry in 2009. Before that, I was in telecom and tech. And in 2009, I got into energy because I realized, I concluded that this is where there were a lot of problems to be solved. And then I've been the CEO of the company since 2009. In December, I stepped down from that position. I'm still on the board. And then besides ARC, I'm also involved with TEDCO, which is the State of Maryland Venture Fund. And then I'm also part of the tech commercialization panel at APL, Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins University, in helping the organization commercialize its technologies. Now, to give you some background on the company, so ARC was founded as an organization to address what we saw as the emerging global requirements for energy. Right? So obviously, with the growth in population, with the increase in the standards of living, the demand for energy is increasing. The question is, can we satisfy that demand in a clean form factor without contributing to climate problems? So ARC 100 as a reactor is ideally suited for emerging countries with inadequate transmission grids. Now this is important. So I'll give you an example. A country like India, 40% of the Indian population has no power. Right, so think about it, not 1 hour, not 2 hours, zero. So 40% of 1.2 billion people. And the problem is not generation, it's transmission. The grid is not there, right? So in instances like that, in markets like that, having a supply source close to the customer could make all the difference. So the solution, the ARC 100, offers a new level of safety and simplicity. It has inherent built-in passive safety, so essentially you cannot have a core meltdown. So as the temperature goes up, there's neutron loss, reactivity comes down, temperature stabilizes. We also have a 20-year refueling cycle. So what this means is that for a lot of developing markets, it's a level of energy security which is important. Not having to look constantly for fuel does make a difference in their assessment. And then the offered solution entails no access to fuel by the customer. We install the reactor, the cartridge goes in, the fuel handling equipment is removed from site. 20 years later, the cartridge is removed, brought back to a pre-designated site. And on the business side, the fuel is always handled separately from the reactor. So this is like a leasing business, and someone else owns the fuel. On our team, we have some leading experts in small reactors and fast reactors. Some details on the reactor itself. It's a small modular reactor, 20-year fueling cycle, 100 megawatts electrical. It's a fast reactor, sodium-cooled metal fuel. Essentially, think of it as uranium-cooled fuel core submerged in liquid sodium with a negative reactivity coefficient to temperature. So temperature goes up, you have neutron loss, and the temperature stabilizes. Now this was proven through repeated experiments within the EBR2 program. This was a program that the DOE, Department of Energy, ran at INL for 30 years, and this was proven repeatedly through experiments at that. Alternative fuel. So to us, all the light water reactor waste that you have today, 70,000 tons in the US plus 3,000 tons that's being added to that stockpile, that is not waste. That material is still about 96% fissile. We can use it up in our reactor as fuel. Now the next point is important, the target cost of energy. So when you design any ventures, any products, start any companies, you cannot lose sight of the commercial aspect of it. So today in the energy world, LCOE, or levelized cost of energy, is very important. And one of the reasons that all options in the US are at a competitive disadvantage to natural gas is because natural gas is very cheap. So we have designed the solution to target a COE of 5 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour. We think that that makes it a very competitive solution, and you have to keep that in mind. Key applications: off-grid electrical production, water desalination, secondarily shale oil extraction, and then cogen applications, process heat. So when you have a lot of heat, some of it can go towards producing electricity, some of it could be used for other applications as well, and this becomes very important in certain parts of the world. To add to that, the technology that we are using is not new. This is a technology that has been derived from the EBR2 and IFR experiences. When we started the process of commercializing this technology, we had two primary objectives. Objective number one was to provide nuclear energy in a configuration and form factor that was suited for developing markets. So you have markets where you just cannot add an 1,100 megawatt reactor to the grid. You just can't do it. So in markets like that, a smaller form factor makes a difference. Primary objective number 2, as the nuclear footprint expands throughout the world, the concerns regarding proliferation are valid. And what we have tried to do is address those concerns effectively so that they could be taken off the table. The safety case that we offer is very different from the safety case that you find in the market today. So the reason that's significant is in our innovation experience, we set off to offer something different, and in the process of offering something different, we wanted to address all the key problems that existed in today's environment, right? So safety is very important. We'd like to take it off the table, as in this is an absolutely safe reactor. The safety case that we present also extends beyond what the NRC has seen in the past. This includes fast reactor initiatives like PRISM, GE PRISM, or Toshiba 4S, and what we offer is substantially different and advanced even over those concepts. Passive decay heat removal, we offer a traditional SCRAM system, but even in instances where the SCRAM system fails, you will not have a core meltdown. That's important. Non-nuclear balance of plant, this is important for 2 reasons. One, it has implications for cost effectiveness for the plant as a whole. And secondly, when you go through the licensing process, this is an important consideration to keep in mind. Seismic isolation, that allows you to place the NSSS, gives you more flexibility in site selection. There's no local scenario. So you cannot have a scenario where you could have a loss of coolant accident. We've built that into the design, again, to address the issue related to safety. So as a result of all this, if in fact an accident did happen, what we expect with the solution is a much lower severity of this accident. So you could not have an explosive event that releases massive amounts of radioactive waste to the atmosphere. That's important. Secondly, if the core were to disintegrate, it would collapse to the bottom of the vessel as debris, coolable debris. And then iodine and cesium are chemically trapped, so you could not have an exposure of that to the atmosphere. Small volume containment, so this means low source term, implications being that you can now have a smaller EPZ, right? So this is the case that we would make to the regulators. Smaller EPZ has significant implications, particularly in markets that have a high population density. So when you think of India, China, some of these markets where the population densities are very high, having a very large EPZ is not practical, right? So you need a solution that can work with a smaller piece of land. There's no on-site spent fuel, as I indicated. The fuel is removed immediately, so therefore there's no on-site fuel handling equipment that's left behind. The core operating parameters for our initial implementation are well within the existing database for metallic fuel, the largest portion of which comes from the EBR2 experience. Our intent is to use that initially, and then subsequently we also have some patents where we will come up with fuel innovations. Digital INC that allows you to monitor as never before. So that's the background. Now I'd like to spend some time on the lessons learned. And some of these lessons are my own, some of these lessons are organizational, but one of the features, one of the facts that I'd like to point out is that in just about all the advanced nuclear activity that's going on in this industry, the technology risk is not the most critical, right? So we've got a reactor that's based on the EBR2 technology. The EBR2 project ran for 30 years, ran extremely well. So we have taken that experience and now we are in the process of commercializing it, right? So the same applies to the molten salt reactors that you see in the market. Oak Ridge National Labs has been working on molten salt technology for a long time. Same thing for high temperature gas-cooled reactors. So the basic technology is not new. The basic technology is well understood, and therefore the technology risks associated with all of these ventures are not the most critical. You have other risks. Licensing is a big risk. Financing is a big risk. Finding a partner to build your first-of-a-kind project is a big risk. But technology risk is not the most critical. Now, the power of incumbency cannot be underestimated. And this is something that we learned the hard way. The Western world, North America, Japan, Western Europe, has a well-understood bias towards large reactors. Large light water reactors is what have been built in this market. That's the bias. And when you come to market with the concept of a smaller reactor that, oh, by the way, has nothing to do with light water technology, that's a difficult concept to sell. And you do have to make a lot of effort doing that. Acute need is a key driver for innovation. Now, some of you might have heard Dr. Lassiter, and he makes this point very compellingly. In places like India, in places like Albania, where you've just got a very acute shortage of power, and the only viable option is something like this, what you find is a very high willingness to try new technology. The challenge, of course, in these markets is that the nuclear infrastructure is not there. They don't have the know-how, they don't have the money. Other than that, it's a great market, right? So you've got to figure out a value proposition where you can meet the customer's requirements. The impact of public policy cannot be overstated. So you have a lot of solar deployment in the US. A lot of it is driven by the extension of the ITC, net metering, same thing for wind, PTC, the production tax credit that helps with that deployment. The Telecom Reform Act of 1996, that's what led to the universally connected society that we live in today. But back then, the situation was very different. I lived through that, and that's when you realize that the impact of public policy can be huge. Reprocessing. So we believe in a closed fuel cycle. To us, nuclear waste is not nuclear waste, it's fuel. And yet in the US, we have a self-imposed ban on all forms of reprocessing, including powder processing, right? So that leads to challenges with the ton. And then, of course, LNT, linear non-threshold way of measuring what an acceptable exposure to radioactivity might be. The biggest hurdle for advanced nuclear deployment in the US is regulatory, and we can talk about it some more. This is a huge hurdle. And a part of the problem is that the NRC is a single mandate organization. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has a single mandate of public safety. That's it. Now you contrast that to the FDA, which is a dual mandate organization. So on one hand, mandate number one is public safety. But there is another mandate. Mandate number two is the promotion of new technology, right? So as a result of that, in 2015, we had a record number of new drugs that were licensed by the FDA or approved by the FDA. The NRC, on the other hand, being a single mandate organization, finds it very difficult to consider anything that's new or different. Raising money for nuclear ventures is hard. I don't know how else to put it. So in the 6 years that I was the CEO, I spent about half my time raising money, and we still didn't have enough. You can never have enough money for these ventures. It's just hard. These kinds of initiatives do not lend themselves easily to the venture model. In my previous life in tech, I did 2 venture-backed startups. In the previous company, I raised 43 million. This is very different, right? So you have to look for other creative forms of financing, and that takes a lot of time. This is an inside joke. When I was in telecom, I used to complain all the time that telecom was a slow market. I have now concluded that that is not true. And then lastly, having said all this, so just in case you think that I'm here to depress you, what I will offer you is, having said all this, the deck is still stacked in your favor. The one thing you find is that you don't get in the way of science, you don't get in the way of money. So as long as you guys are advancing the state of science, and as long as some of your ideas are backed by sound economics, in the long run, they'll prevail. But in that process, I'd like to leave you with this last thought. This is one of my favorite quotes. Different people take it differently. What I'm trying to tell you with this quote is, as you embark on this journey of yours, be absolutely brutally honest with yourself. So understand where you are, understand what your limitations are, understand how far your objective is, understand what that gap is, and then figure out practical ways of meeting that gap. Thank you.
What's the technology that came into play that just made Nintendo $9 billion? Smartphones. What else? GPS. Internet, augmented reality, video processing, right? A combination of new technologies has unlocked a ton of potential for this company, right? They have created a new viral game that this company did not have before, right? It's a startup. It didn't exist. Pokemon Go did not exist 3 years ago. It actually existed in another form called Egress, which was a geocaching game, but Pokemon Go itself didn't exist. And the point I'm trying to make to you is that basically my job, the job I have with my company, Exelon, is to create the new Pokemon Go for the nuclear industry. So what do I do? And what is Exelon? I know, because you're like, what is that? That's so crazy. Exelon is the largest commercial nuclear operator in the US. It's the 5th largest in the world. We are the largest non-government controlled nuclear company on the planet. We have almost 20 gigawatts of nuclear power under our control at any given moment. Now, how much of the nuclear industry do you think has changed in the way we operate those plants in the last 20 to 25 years? right? Back when Pokemon Go first came out with cards, right? Pokemon came out with cards 20 years ago. Do you think we're operating significantly differently today, or do you think we're operating just pretty much about the same?
Operating better.
Operating better. We got better performance. I give you that. I'll give you better performance. I like that. You know your history. But differently? Nah, not at all. So Exelon has put a stake in the ground, and my friends at EPRI and everywhere else can attest to this. We put a stake in the ground and we said we are going to rely on innovation in order to improve our performance, to reimagine how we run this business day in and day out, right? And I am part of the leading that innovation charge for the company. My job, I have 3 primary responsibilities for my group. 1, the culture of innovation, right? Innovation cannot just lie within a single person. Innovation has to be everyone's responsibility. I'm not that smart. You're all smarter than me, trust me. How many new keys? I think I saw like 90% of you are new keys. Who's the social person? Who's the person that wants to help people? Nice. I love you. We need you, and I'm gonna tell you why we need you later. But yeah, most of you are nuclear engineers. You're probably going to wind up going to PhDs. You're probably going to wind up going working in a national lab. You should go work in commercial nuclear reactors because it's a hell of a lot of fun. But whatever you do, you're probably smarter than me. But you're closer to problems than I am. And this is where we need everyone, including you, and it's why I'm so excited that you guys are here, to understand these entrepreneurial concepts and understand how important innovation is. Because people can't just rely on 1 or 2 people to make things happen. We need the mind share of pretty much the entire world, our entire nuclear world, working on these problems, finding new ways to solve things, right? I cannot figure out by myself how to extend a commercial reactor to 80 years of licensing or 100 years of licensing. But I guarantee you, the people in this room probably could figure it out. Second part of my job. So we do things in the culture of innovation to inspire people. We go out and do events like this. We talk to startup companies. We had called Dancing with the Startups. We have an innovation event every year where we bring 1,200 of our employees to, and have motivational speakers. It's better than the Democratic National Convention. But they got Lady Gaga, so it's kind of tough to beat. The second part of my job, I look for new and emerging technologies and I bring them into our existing operating units to improve our business. Now what's that look like, okay? I'm the first guy that brought Google Glass into a nuclear power plant. I brought an augmented reality, a telepresence robot into a nuclear power plant to help us view a source change of a radioactive source. I'm kind of do a lot of the firsts, right? And I bring in all these new technologies that in a lot of cases aren't fully baked, that don't all the time work, and I figure out how can this help us make our business better. The third part of my job, startups, right? We have an entrepreneurial wing in our company that said we want to take new ideas and grow them ourselves, right? We have a lot of really smart employees. We have over 30,000 employees. They have some pretty good ideas for new companies too, and new ideas. So me, as a entrepreneur in residence, I help those people with those ideas and learn how to take them into market, right? So 3 things in my job. Culture of innovation, innovate for efficiency, innovate for growth. Now, I'm not going to bore you with a whole lot of statistics. I'm just going to leave you with a story though, because it's an important story because it illustrates a couple of key points that I want you to remember as you're going through this process. So one of the first things I did was I brought in, I talked about that telepresence robot I brought into the power block, right? And I asked my boss, I'm like, I need $2,500 for this robot. I want to try it out for something. And he kind of laughed at me. He's like, yeah, whatever, go play. But he gave me the money, right? And I got a couple people at the site really excited to try it because it was new technology, and they're always up to trying something new. And we brought it into the power block, and I had a circle of 11 executives looking on this tiny 12-inch screen of an iPad, observing an evolution 300 yards away inside the power block. Now, I got a great picture of them, but they were all just entranced in this little 12-inch monitor. And what was important was that they were super excited about it, and they were trying to deploy it, and I knew it wouldn't go anywhere because just the form factor wasn't right. But what I did was I listened to them. I listened to what they were saying about what their real problem was, right? Their real problem was that they wanted that ability to see what I see, that remote expert opportunity. But they needed a different form factor. That launched us into getting Google Glass, that launched us into DAQRI Smart Helmet, and that ultimately launched us into a project we call Vision, which is going to revolutionize clearance and tagging in our industry, right? The key point I'm trying to make here is you have to listen to your customers, right? You guys have great ideas, and you're some of the smartest people in the world, right? But ultimately, they talk about markets, and they talk, you've heard these guys talk about, developing markets and commercialization. Ultimately, it's about listening to your customers and finding out where their problems are and identifying where you have a product and a market fit, right? That's where you really start to see that explosive growth, right? Product market fit is what you need to strive for as an entrepreneur. All right, I'm not going to bore you anymore. If you've got questions, we'll do it in Q&A, but hi, thanks.
Back in the explosion of what was called clean tech back in 2008, 2006, 2007, 2008, where everybody was raising a fund to try to find companies who had new technologies in the field of energy. Unfortunately for you guys, that has died off a bit. Fortunately for you guys, and I'll echo that very strongly, there is a need, and it will never really die off. And so it used to be that venture capitalists were looking for companies, and now there are other people in other structures that are kind of forming to do this. And all they need is people with ideas and people with the will to do things. So that's what I think you should retain from this, and find people and tools and models and frameworks that you can toy with, decide which works for you, and then go with it. So these venture capitalists decided to look at the whole range of energies, from solar to wind to power. And then they figured out that they were struggling to find something that they liked, and they realized no one was investing in nuclear for reasons that have been explained, which is high capital intensity, very long sales cycle, very high regulatory environment. So they said, no one's looking at that. Let's look at that. Maybe there is a play in there. And they looked at everything from mining uranium to enriching uranium differently to new small modular reactors all the way up to the waste. And their conclusion at the time, and given what they wanted to do, was there is probably a way to invest a decently small amount of money and have outside return in the realm of nuclear waste. And that was in 2008. I was finishing my MBA at MIT. I also have a PhD in physics. I don't have a nuclear engineering background, but I wanted to start something in energy. And I got friendly with those investors. I was helping them do due diligence. And so they got me on board with that venture. So I'm one of the founders, together with an industry expert named John Remmel, about twice my age. And we started this company together, backed by the VC from the start, which was really lucky for us to be able to find that original investment, because you can die trying to find that original investment. That's problematic. We raised about $3 million from those investors and others, and started developing what we believe to be our silver bullet in our technology, which is basically a better way to capture waste, radioactive waste of water, mostly cesium-137, cobalt-60, strontium-90, which are the three big ones you'll always hear about if you're a nuclear engineer. Get them out of water. They're mostly dissolved. Sometimes they're suspended solid, but mostly dissolved. Capture that onto a material, and then vitrify that material. So you reduce the volume, it gets out of the waterways, and if you can render that service at a cost that is much less than the rest of the scenario, which is deal with water, capture water, trap water, put that into a disposal site where they charge by the cubic feet as opposed to the radioactive content. You're able to charge a lot more money make good margins, but still be less expensive than the other pathway. And that's kind of my second message is if you find a business model innovation, you're probably more likely to succeed than if you find a really good technology. And I think we've heard that is trying to find what exists, trying to find what's currently problematic for people, and combine it together in a new business model that works for your customers is very important. So we set up to do those things where we have those materials that we designed, and then this vitrification technology, and then in 2011 Fukushima happened, which arguably is a big problem for the nuclear industry. Was very good for us because if you have ever seen customer pain when you arrive at Fukushima and you have a solution for nuclear waste, you see customer pain. And that's the one thing that I remember all my life is talking to the Japanese. We had never intended to go in Japan with Kurion. The relationship between the Japanese and the US especially, you've probably overheard in the highway that you steal your technologies and you sell them once, it's like China, but a little more evolved. None of that is, of course, very true. It's very stereotypical. But when you look at developing your market, you go or US-based. So we never thought to go to Japan. But Fukushima happened, and we jumped on the plane and we went to Japan. And then we had one very key contract where in about 5.5 weeks, we had to build 700 tons of equipment, all new. We had no design for it, and deliver it and start it up. And so I spent about 15 days at Fukushima at a time where it was fairly highly radioactive, and I glow in the dark, which is cool. and at the end of this adventure, we had to then decide that we were not going to stay a one-trick pony and develop the company further. And so we expanded in Japan, France, UK, US, all markets that all of you will recognize as all the nuclear energy markets. And about 6 months ago, after building a company from 2 employees to about 180 employees, our investors, of course, 7 years in, wanted to pass on the baton and make a return on their investment. And so we found a grand brother called Veolia, who acquired the company for $350 million. So it was a pretty good deal for our investors. We did okay. So I'm looking to invest in you. And Kurion is hiring, so come talk to me at the end. Thank you.
You're all from very different kinds of backgrounds, which is what we were shooting for, so that worked, I think. But what about innovating inside of a startup company, or even an existing company trying to take more of a startup approach, differentiates you from a national laboratory or a university or a standard private company? So what's different about how you approach innovation?
One of the things that we always stress in the commercial environment, and this is not by choice, is the commercial world is not in the business of doing science experiments, right? So if we do anything, it's with a very specific focus objective of solving some real problem that perhaps takes you towards your objectives. And this is particularly true for privately funded companies. When you raise money from private sources, besides the fact that it's never enough, you also have this constant feeling of responsibility that someone's trusting in you, putting their investment in you, and you've got to give them back a return. Even though the final return might be many years away, you're still constantly trying to show progress, right? So there's a sense of urgency that's very practical, and that focuses you, or should focus you. Unlike a national lab, which also does wonderful work, but it's more longer term, it's more fundamental, it's more basic, and then good things will result from that, but you don't have the same level of urgency in a national lab environment that you might in a commercial.
These type of efforts tend to be highly results driven, right? And a result is not a PowerPoint deck. A result is not a paper. A result is customers, customer counts, money, revenue, right? And it's playing at a much different level than you would at a university or at a national lab, right? So that I think is one of the big differences. The other one I think is important too, and it's a pretty big distinction when you go from a single investor to multiple investors. I deal with multiple investors in my own company. They all have to buy in. a single investor, you can have a really good idea, they can believe in you and kind of give you a long lead time, but once you start dealing with multiple stakeholders, then that becomes a lot more effort to deal with. So I think, results driven and highly communicative, you're going to be constantly talking and communicating about your business all the time to ensure you hit all your stakeholders once you start to expand.
Innovation in startups, in my opinion, and companies does not mean having the best product. It means having a solution that is practicable, sellable, deployable in the field in ways that are much better than your competitors. And you've all heard about the example of VHS versus Betamax. It's a very famously used, but you'll find that it applies almost everywhere. You don't necessarily have to have the best product. And B, you do need a salesperson. Or, I would argue, in nuclear, a deal maker. If you have a product that productizes on this, you can have a salesperson that's very good early on in your company. I am not the deal maker. John Raymond was, who was kind of my partner in crime. But you need someone who is going to be able to go talk to the customer at some point, sell the solution, not listen and then craft something that works and check that it's going to work in the market, but also go and then convince a first customer to buy that solution. That's the only way you turn innovation into a sale. Now, at Kurion, case in point, when we showed up at Fukushima, we had something that had been tested. It was among the good products, but what we said is, we'll work with you, TEPCO, who is the company who won Fukushima, and we'll implement this with you. Because the problem they had at the time is TEPCO operates nuclear power plant. And even though you'd think that they know how to deal with a failing nuclear power plant, they never fail exactly per the plan. There is no plan. Here is how you fail, and here's how you're going to recover. You have all sorts of procedures, and the nuclear industry, in my opinion, is much, much, much better than every other industry I can think of in energy in terms of recovery, planning ahead, having all sorts of ways, but there are always things that you cannot predict. And so if you come and you go to your customer and you commit to provide that solution with them, and it might not be your original business model. We wanted to sell a product. No, we have to implement a solution for our customer. But then you create that first relationship and this first impetus for your company. And so you've got to find that flexibility. If it had not been Fukushima for us, probably something else. But the ability to do pattern recognition and kind of try to find a way to fit in and propose a business and a solution that works for everybody, from the engineer in front of you to the financial person who's going to write the check, to the CEO who's going to be able to understand why that makes sense, is really much more important than I'm going to show you the coolest product and no one can do what we do. By way of strict innovation, I feel.
Are there specific challenges that you'd like to see solved? So are there things, so is there advice for them, or what kinds of problems could be tackled?
Nuclear doesn't communicate well, right? We are terrible as an industry at communicating. You look at what's happening in California, how, with San Onofre and Diablo Canyon, both those plants have long life cycle left. Over the years, ever since TMI, we have failed in communications and failed to engage in public policy in a clever way. And one of the challenges that I think I would like to see this group, potentially take a crack at is there a way that we can do this better? I was looking at, I work a lot with Nest, and they have, their company mascot is this dog who has over 500,000 Twitter followers. A dog, who puts out random tweets, has 500,000 Twitter followers, and, we have this phenomenal technology which, creates, zero carbon emissions, thousands of great paying jobs, and, by and large, there's not a lot of public support for it. So can we do that different?
To know what's going to be your biggest problem to solve, you kind of want to project yourself in the what would it look like when this is deployed, how people would buy it, and how would that work, and then kind of get a sense for all that to happen. What are the most important things that we don't have right now? And my gut tells me that what you'll find out, it's not necessarily a technology advancement, but a great deal of focusing on the right thing, whether it's your cost structure, whether it's, let me take a simple example of cost structure and I'll stop there, but a lot of times you think you need a great technology enhancement and you realize that you're going to have two big balancing acts. One is going to be the labor around either producing your product or using your product. And if it's qualified labor, nuclear reactor can be very expensive. So automatization, mobile, all the new technologies can help with that. Some other times it can be something in your supply chain that's very expensive. Again, nuclear reactors, big components for large nuclear reactors are very expensive. And so that, to the extent that you're trying to figure out how you could build a new innovative product, finding, at least because you're going to be all together with different backgrounds and different ways to reach out to people, finding a prioritized list of things that either you don't know about and you're afraid that it could be really problematic, or you all know about and it's very problematic. It could be either one, right? What we know we don't know, or what we know and we got to work on it. And then really focus on that and have fun saying, okay, how would we de-risk that aspect? And don't think that this aspect is going to have to be, let's try to showcase a product that no one would have ever thought about. It could be something much simpler, as we mentioned, that's like, and then that might create a lot of impetus for you to move to another, not necessarily your project, but another project on the side of that where suddenly things unlock and you say, okay, that would work in this direction. And that's kind of this little bit of a playing with frameworks and model, not necessarily following a lot of recipe, but really asking how is that puzzle going to fit together? And the missing piece is sometimes very surprising when you start really thinking of, is that really the hardest part of the puzzle? And it's rarely a technology barrier. It can be, but it's rarely what it is.
The biggest hurdle in the US for any new nuclear deployment is regulatory, getting through the NRC. And a big part of the challenge is that the NRC tends to be a very physically oriented organization. So everything has to be proven through experiments and prototypes. And I'm not a nuclear engineer by education, I'm an electrical engineer. So coming at it from the computational sciences, I think we don't utilize the new capabilities enough. And my holy grail is if I could find or design a system that could completely emulate or describe the performance of my reactor today and then predict it 20 years in the future, and then be able to use that to make a licensing case where it no longer takes me 12 years to get my reactor licensed, now I can get it licensed in 6. I think that's a huge area of opportunity, and then people are beginning to step up. But in nuclear field in general, what I find is that the use of computational capability, modeling, simulation is still extremely limited. When you look at the 777, for instance, the entire plane was designed on paper, right? Before, of course, you do experiments along the way to make sure that your models are accurate. But in nuclear, we're so physically oriented that everything has to be a physical experiment in the lab and a prototype has to be built and tested. Well, I have a fueling cycle of 20 years. So if the requirement is run a prototype for 20 years before we license it, I'm dead, right? So I think that's an area where there's a lot of opportunity. Secondly, at a more mundane level, energy conversion systems. So today, what we propose to use in our reactor is the Gaetan cycle, supercritical CO2, to get higher efficiencies. And as a fallback, we can always use a Rankine cycle, but you don't get as much output. But that's another area, I think, where there's room for innovation. Then on the non-technical side, there's a whole big problem that no one has solved, and we're all rooting for NuScale with the new UAMPS opportunity. How do you build a folk system, first of a kind system? Because that initial system is going to cost you $1 to $2 billion, and that's sunk cost, right? So it's entirely a prototype. Now, a PPA at the end of that process would make it easier, but nobody's really solved that problem completely. NuScale is at the leading edge of that discussion, and they're taking it one step at a time. But I think there's a lot of room for creative thought in that area as well.
How do you adapt your business models, or do you adapt your business models as you go into a specific market? Is my first question. And my second question is, how, as more participants seek to also service these emerging markets, increase or join you guys, who or what organization do you foresee taking a more authoritative role within regulations in the global arena?
in our case, and this is true, well, let's back up. When you look at PRISM, GE PRISM, that's not a new project. That project has been going on for a long time. Toshiba 4S, they had an opportunity in Alaska with Galena, and they went through the pre-licensing process, and then they stopped. A big part of the problem with the NRC today is that it's a very good organization for licensing or overseeing large light water reactors. Outside of that, the NRC has no expertise. So in our case, we're actually not going through the NRC as a first instance. We're getting our reactor initially licensed in Canada. So that's where we are spending a lot of time. And in fact, we think our first build will be in Canada as well. And this is for a number of practical and other reasons. But sometimes you just can't get it, right? So a company that are privately funded have limited time and dollars, and they have to maximize it. Then in terms of the larger question that you were asking, the IAEA provides an umbrella of oversight globally, and they have some very well-written documents that can help companies either move to nuclear or even existing nuclear states utilize that capability. But there's always, the requirement's always that there should be some reputable licensing authority behind a particular license or particular design. So when you look at the CANDU reactor, for example, that came out of Canada, that's probably got the largest global footprint. In a number of instances, the Canadian CNSC stood behind that design, and then the local licensing authorities kind of gave it their stamp of approval. But there always has to be a reputable licensing agency standing behind a design, and then you need local oversight. And you always work in that regard.
If you're all trying to make Pokemon Go, but there's no nostalgia for Pokemon cards out there, then when do we make Ingress 2 instead? Yeah.
One of the startup companies that we had was looking to do all this distributed generation at somebody's home. I mean, this mixture of solar and wind and all these new technologies. When we actually got out and started talking to customers, right, and really saw what they want, we saw that what customers really wanted was a backup generator because they valued reliability over everything else. So then we had that decision point where you've got to pivot or you persevere. But this is really where getting out of the lab, and I mean, if you ever read Lean Startup Handbook, I suggest you all read it, it's great. But they always talk about getting out of the lab and getting in front of customers, because really they are your market makers, and they'll help you get to that pivot or persevere point really quickly. A lot quicker than, say, if you go down, you're like, I believe in this technology, I'm investing millions and millions and millions of dollars, because at the end of the day, you don't want to end up with the wrong colored rock, right? You want to bring the rock that the customer wants, that they're willing to pay for. But you're only going to find that out if you talk.
It seems like, unlike maybe like working like electrical computer engineering, something like that, where you can just make like a startup like straight out as like a college graduate, it seems like the nuclear industry is somewhat gated behind like some form of experience, whether that be either going through graduate school and while you're there, as you're getting your degree, you come up with some idea, or you go into industry and you kind of see those needs that are unmet. And so I guess I have kind of a two-part question. First, like between those like kind of two paths that, in my opinion, like limited experience I've seen, like do you think one is like better than the other? And then also, do you think the nuclear industry has like any potential for that just like straight out of college like kind of startup?
Where's your degree from?
Pretty good.
That's a big deal. Yeah. You have an engineering degree?
Yeah.
Well, I know plenty of my friends computer science who wish they had your degree. So don't sell yourself short on that. You have a network of people around you. You cannot underestimate the fascination of people for a .edu email address. Once you have it, or even in alum.goodschool.edu, and pretty definitely is one of these. People will reply to you. You can find plenty of people to support you. Rest assured that we're here because we know it's hard. We know it's hard on certain aspects versus computer science. But because we know it's hard, we're willing to support as well, right? So I think you'll find, as long as you're modeling your way through and you've got an intention, you will find plenty of people that help you. And yes, raising money is hard and all that stuff, but you've got to find your way around that. If you're trying to build a new generation nuclear reactor, yeah, you probably need someone who can speak the technicality behind it, because just the intent's not going to be enough for something like that. But if you have a new way for nuclear operators to communicate, yeah, it might not be that bad. And it might work in that market, because you're passionate about that market. And even though Slack's all over Silicon Valley, I don't think nuclear operators use it. I don't think nuclear operators use Skype. I don't think they use, because there are layers. They might, but some others might have their boss say, you can't use Skype, it's not secure. Or I don't like Microsoft. But you're going to be in contact with people, and you can get in there and then start growing a business.
Yeah.
If I can just add to that, I mean, I'm not on the panel, so I'm an old grey-haired guy from the UK originally, I'm British national anthem. I agree with all the sentiments. I would support you so much more than people who are doing kind of, computer science and so on, because it's so much easier historically getting computer science than it is doing what we do now. But what I will say, one thing is, don't think that the innovation is needed in nuclear is all about developing the next reactor. Because you're absolutely right, it's exactly what you were just saying. There is so much innovation needed across, and Kurion is a perfect example of waste management. Is a great example of where, it's waste always seems to be boring and so on, but the amount of money and problems you solve is a fascinating area. We just heard again about from Exelon in terms of using virtual reality or an existing technology applied in a different way that nobody else has thought about. It's tremendously exciting and a great opportunity. And the other thing I would say is that having worked in the UK nuclear industry for 20 years before I moved to Oak Ridge, one thing that always used to annoy me, but I found it fascinating, was when I had a student come in and work with me, a PhD student undergrad, and they would say, why do you do it like that in the nuclear industry? And it would be so damn annoying when they ask that question, because that's the most hardest question to answer. And what you guys bring is a fresh look at things, new set of eyes, different perspective, whether it's a new technology, a new vision, a new perspective. It's so important to have that. So don't underestimate your naivety, if you want to look at that. Naivety in asking these difficult questions is incredibly important. So I couldn't agree more. Don't put yourself down.
Yeah. Let me just add one last point. My entire team of direct reports that reports to me, they're all co-ops. We work with Drexel a lot. Drexel has a great co-op program. They're all co-ops, because of just that, because they're bringing fresh ideas in, and they're building real products that, they may want to start a business with someday, but they're building real products and real solutions to solve real world problems for me, during their time with me. So you're not going to be able to, straight out of college, come up with a brand new reactor. Probably not. But you know what? There's a ton of opportunity out there that you can really make a big difference at.
If one startup is successful, we then try to generalize that model, and then everybody's a Facebook. In the end, having, from the other side as well, as an investor, ultimately, what people are looking for is how well do you understand what you're proposing to do? How well defined is your plan, at least at this point, for what you would like to do, and how credible are you as a person, right? So if you look at the nuclear industry, you've got Transatomic, which is Leslie Dewan's company. You've got Oakville down here, which is Jacob DeWitt's company. You've got Elysium up in Boston as well, another molten salt reactor. Then you've got Terrestrial Energy up in Canada. And if you look at the principles behind each one of these initiatives, they're very different. But I think the one element they all have in common is that it's a credible team that seems to understand very well the problem it's solving, seems to have a plausible plan for solving that problem, and has a convincing argument for the fact that when that problem is solved, investors will make lots of money. That's it. In the end, if I like what you're saying, I'm probably not going to spend much time on your educational background. Right? I'm going to probe you. I'm going to use that as one of my data points to figure out how credible you are. But the effectiveness of your argument is up to you. And if you are proposing to design a new nuclear reactor, recognizing that that's a large task, and you have assembled a team that could help you do that, you will be more credible than just walking in by yourself saying, I'm going to design the whole reactor by myself.
Startup companies currently are to follow more secret paths and keep their cards close to their chest. I was wondering if you guys could speak about that and the other side of the coin, where you have to actually go and publicize your technology and get investors on board. So how do you balance the secrecy aspect?
Just about every fast reactor design that's been commercialized is based on EBO2. right? So whether it's us or it's Prism or it's Toshiba or it's Toshiba slightly different, but still the core technology is based on that, or Oklo. All of these designs are based on EBR2 technology. Now, there are areas of IP that need to be protected, and for that you do patents. So we have a portfolio of 7 patents that we defend in 6 different jurisdictions. And in the end, the question that you're trying to answer is if you have some kind of a secret sauce or technical advantage, how do you maintain it? And sometimes IP protection makes sense. But in general, though, in this business where the types of investors are very different, right? This is not a commercial business in the sense that you're not going for 50 million eyeballs. This is a very specific, big iron, I don't know how to make it all into software, product. And the kinds of investors that you will engage with will be domain specific. So the question that they're looking for is not necessarily how visible are you, but in the solution that you're providing, if IP protection is important, how well is your IP protected? Now, this is very different from the telecom, networking, social media business, where the dynamics are completely different. So at some point, these issues do become domain specific.
Michael.
So this is for everyone, but probably most appropriately Mr. Ali, because your company is looking to sell reactors to developing countries. What do you think the role of philanthropist investors is in the nuclear industry, considering climate change, energy poverty, and the need for clean water in the coming years? What do you think that the role of these highfalutin investors, these philanthropists, are?
I think the answer is it's huge. So one of the organizations that I'm involved in DC, it's a nonprofit called the Energy Innovation Reform Project. So it's a bipartisan organization that's focused on advancing the discussion of climate science, clean energy, and our primary focus at this point is on center-right of the political spectrum, because on the center-left you're preaching to the choir, on the center-right not so much. And that effort is entirely funded by foundations like the Hewlett Foundation and a number of other organizations like that. So I think that is extremely important. And then, but more importantly, that discussion then also leads you to a certain kind of investor, right? So for ARC, the company that I was talking about, we don't have any traditional VCs as our investors. The model just didn't fit. Our largest investor is actually a real estate fund out of Paris. And then you have a number of private individual investors who are committed to the notion of clean energy and climate change, right? So to some extent, this investment is very specific. And, because again, this is a long-term investment. This is, does not fit a typical venture model. The venture fund is raised, it's a 10-year fund. And they like to have a liquidity event or an exit within that 10 years. Well, you're not going to have that for a nuclear venture, right? So this is why you are then drawn to a very specific type of investor who's willing and has a non-financial incentive in some cases to make this long bet because they believe that this is good for mankind.
Investors pretty much across the board are much more sensitive to sustainability, right? That is has become a huge topic, and if you go to Exelon's page, we have a 135-page sustainability report that we put out every year that talks about our sustainability profile. But from the investor community broadly, we hear that echoed back to us that they are looking for companies to have a strong sustainability profile. So I think what, beyond just philanthropist investors, I think you're starting to see a much more environmentally aware approach to investing broadly.
Someone over there says something about us afterwards creating a startup. Now, you mentioned about having an idea and how you have to go through sort of phase, okay, look at your market, what's your idea, how do you get there, these sorts of questions. And actually, as a PhD student, I'm sure there's a number of us in here, you kind of do that on your own in your PhD. You put some hooks out, you find out what's going to bite, and then you have to hypothesize, and you have to, I've just had my first year review, and you have to say what you're going to do, why you're going to do it, and you have to justify it. And I just got myself thinking, it's actually not dissimilar, if you look at it from a certain perspective, to the innovation pathways in startup companies, because you have to have a clear goal. You have to say, I'm going to get there by doing this, this, and this. And you have to, it's really stringent in the UK, I don't know what it's like over here. And the second question kind of links to, well, the first one was a comment, but the second question is kind of on, so again, it's a European thing, so hopefully my European colleagues can back me up here. But innovation is not really taught. So other than this opportunity we've got today, we aren't really taught to do that. Like I've always seen it until the last sort of year or so. That I've got two pathways in life. I can either go join an industry and work my way up, or I can stay in research and do that. And there's not really much room for innovation, particularly in the UK. You know, the program we're on, actually Catherine and Mark over there, the program we're on, I said, oh, do you want to go to this? I was like, yeah, because nothing else comes up. So could you comment on that?
Well, so for the last point, actually, can I comment on that? So that's specifically why we decided to make this boot camp. Really is, in the last year, there's been an enormous amount of publicity and sort of noticing that nuclear is starting to move in a way that is, I would arguably unprecedented. And so the GAIN initiative happened, which we'll hear more about next week also, which is trying to facilitate successive startups by allowing access to US government facilities. And then we started talking about, well, maybe we need a nuclear incubator or accelerator to support those companies so that they're more likely to succeed. And then we said, right, but we have to train the workforce. And so in February, I was like, so, 2 weeks, can we pull it off? August, what do you think? And that's what this is. And we're planning, and I'm actually in my spare time this week, writing a proposal to get funding to expand this next year to a 6-week program so that it's more in depth. And we would love to have this expand across the US and actually internationally so that we address specifically this problem.
All you need is a first customer. Okay, so, and a lot of them are going to say no for whatever reason. And most of them won't even tell you the real reason why. So listening to get feedback, to deal with that rejection, and to overcome it, to find your first customer is super important, in my opinion. And it's as researchers, it's really hard. But you know, sales guys always like, it's hard to be a sales guy. I get rejected 90% of the time. Well, say I was a PhD, I was rejected 99.9% of the time before I found one thing that I could defend my thesis on. But it was by nature, it was not human interactions. And that's a very important part of entrepreneurship. It's a team sport, and the customer is part of your team for you to sell to them. And at first they'll tell you they don't. It looks like they'll tell you they don't like you, but that's not what it is. And that's a big difference, in my opinion.
Yeah, so as someone who came from science and went to the dark side of business, which we all think is the dark side of business, if you want to do innovation, if you start to like the dark side, find a way that works for you to deal with that. And realize one thing, in science and in engineering, which is when you'll deploy your solution, you'll need 99+%, and that's how you'll build a reputation. When you throw things out there, whether it's you want to protect yourself on IPO, and you'll have a range of options. But remember, on the business side, and that's why you don't like business people, and I didn't at first, sometimes you could get away with 50%. You do 50% of the work, and you'll get a buy decision. In science, you can't do that, so we've been trained to get, you know, the A grades, I gotta have it all figured out. You need to figure out some things. Mostly you need to figure out how either you're gonna get money to get further, or you get a first customer that's ideal, that's gonna fund the rest of the development of your company. And on the business side, again, you don't need to have 100% figured out. There's plenty you can do without having figured out, but ask for help from a lot of people, including some customers. Customers sometimes are surprising if you ask for help. They'll say no, but they'll tell you why. If you say, I need help, I don't understand why you don't want to buy this, as opposed to, well, you're an asshole, you don't want to buy my product, right? So this ability to say, you know, I can get by in business with a lot, and then once you have that first person hook, then execution come in. And execution is 99%. And that's where we need engineers every time. Guaranteed, salespeople won't do the execution in terms of delivering the product that's going to make the experience worse, buying again, or telling someone to buy from you.
You're going to need a lot of different people, and you're going to need a lot of different skills in order to make successful startup businesses work, right? My best skill is I'm a translator. I can take what all of you smart people say, understand it, and break it down for the money people to make it work for them, right? Know that you're trying to innovate in the most risk-averse industry in the world. So that inherently has its challenges. But also know that there is a ton of opportunity out there. This industry has not changed largely in the last 2 decades in the way it runs, and there's a ton of opportunity for innovation. You know, you talk about startup companies. You know, we talked about computational science earlier. There's a ton of opportunity in computational science. Come up with a great algorithm to figure out how we can extend life cycles of certain big pieces of equipment. Oh my God, you're gonna make a ton of money because somebody's gonna buy it.
You know, and I'll say this carefully, entrepreneurship is overrated if it's for the wrong reasons. If it's for the right reasons, it's fantastic. You know, I love the process of bringing technology to market. Wouldn't want to do anything else in my life. But it's also a very individual journey. I mean, you know, we have this tendency in the industry to always try and take one success and then generalize it. It doesn't work that way. Each one of you, as you build your companies, you're going to embark on your own very individual journey. Now, you learn from other experiences, and that's always important. But the journey that you define and the journey that you start and the journey that you finish, whatever the outcome, will be a very individual journey. And as you go through that journey, you'll find that oftentimes it's very lonely. You know, you are by yourself. And the one thing that keeps you going at those times is your passion. So if you want to do something, if you want to start a company, if you want to be an entrepreneur, the only thing that will sustain you through those times is passion for what you are doing and a belief in yourself that you are right while everybody else is wrong. Now, you may be wrong in the end. That's a different issue. But without that belief, you won't complete the journey.